by Professor Malini Bhattacharjee, political scientist, author, Associate Professor Azim Premji University, on her book Disaster Relief and the RSS, Resurrecting Religion Through Humanitarianism.
Okay, while they set it up, I think, oh, it's already there. Thank you. A lot of students I see are leaving, which is disappointing. So if you can come back, that'll be great. Thank you so much, everyone. My name is Malini, and I want to begin by saying thank you to the organizers for having me here. I'm particularly grateful not just for being given a platform to speak about my book, but particularly grateful because it's a book that was published in the year 2019. And there are academics in this room who will perhaps agree with me that for writers, for authors, for teachers, topicality of the book is very important, right? And we feel very conscious speaking about something that is dated, that is not recent. And therefore, to speak about a book 6 years after its publication puts that much more pressure on me. But it's also a huge opportunity. So when I thought of what should I talk about for my presentation today, I decided not to get into the empirical details that I had collected while doing the research for this book, but to stick to some of the enduring themes that continue to invigorate the work that I do even today. And one of the enduring themes that has stayed with me, that I use in my research, in my teaching, is the idea of the limitations of the secular, right? And when I say limitations of the secular, I do not allude to the idea of secularism per se, but in the larger evolution of history of ideas, why I think the idea of the secular is limiting as far as understanding the Indian polity and the Indian social is concerned. So I'll begin there, but before getting into my book, I just wanted to ask, is there anyone here who has not heard or does not know much about the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh or RSS? Is there anyone in the room who is not familiar with the RSS? Perhaps it's a wrong question to ask. Okay, so that already makes my life easier. Before getting into the book discussion, I also want to talk, or rather briefly, take you back to Prime Minister Modi's speech, this 15th of August, which was made from the ramparts of the Red Fort. And very unusually, for the first time perhaps, a Prime Minister alluded to the RSS during a speech that was given out on 15th of August, India's Independence Day. And from a lot of other things that he said, one of the things that he mentioned very clearly, or rather said, was how a 100-year-old organization like the RSS is the world's biggest NGO, and how it has dedicated Swayamsevaks who are part of the RSS have dedicated themselves to doing seva or doing service for Samaj. Coming from the Prime Minister, it was huge acknowledgement for an organization that had a very humble beginning in 1925, which was set up by Dr. Keshav Baliram Hedgevar with just 5 members in Nagpur. And I write about the Prime Minister's speech in a Deccan Herald piece that came out recently, where I argue that from time to time, a nation curates its own history. A nation writes its own script about what is legitimate history and who gets included and who gets excluded from that history, gives us a sense of the current priorities, but also gives us a sense of what has been marginalized and what has been suppressed for very long. with just that 2 or 3 minute acknowledgement of the RSS's contribution to nation building, the Prime Minister tries to correct the ways in which contributors of nation building have been acknowledged in India's political history. With that context, let me get to the book. And when I was very clear, I was a student in JNU when I decided to do a PhD on the RSS, and the mahal of JNU was very different from how it was today. But I was very clear and very sure, very determined that I wanted to do research on the RSS. But one of the things that I was really grappling with is, what does one say or write about the RSS that people already do not know of? Perhaps the most controversial organization, cultural organization in India that so many people have written about, commented about. And there are broadly two strands to the kind of work that has emerged about the RSS. The more dominant, the more common strand of literature is from the detractors, from the critics of the RSS, who have lambasted the organization and called it communal, called it fascist, have labeled it as being anti-minority, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, you have another set of literature which have been written by Swayamsevaks themselves, which, according to me at least, is not, again, let's not put it what it lacks, but for want of any other word, less critical or less reflective of the organization. So, trying to grapple with that question, I decided to work on something that had not been studied at depth so far, and which is the institution of seva or service, which according to me is one of the central organizing pillars of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. So with that context, let me begin. One of the questions that I asked myself is, why study the RSS through the entry point or through the institution of seva or service? And like I said, dominant narratives have reduced the RSS to a political threat to secularism. That was one of the stereotypical understandings that I wanted to address through my work. I also realized that humanitarian work, I'm sorry, I'm not being able to read that font very clearly, so I'm turning this side constantly. Humanitarian work offers a different, less explored lens, and it pushes us to confront moral and analytical discomforts. What do I mean when I say that, right? So often when we think of humanitarian work, meaning work, social work that happens after a disaster strikes, or social work relating to education, relating to healthcare activities, relating to livelihood generation, for example, we do not really understand humanitarian work in the complexity that it demands. It usually tends to be seen in more black and white terms, as people either doing good work or people doing not so good work, and that it is that complexity that I wanted to address. This would be helpful, thank you. So the key questions that I began with is, and given that my discipline is politics or political science, there was so much written by political scientists, sociologists in particular, about what helps the BJP come to power, or what, since 2014, has retained Hindutva as a legitimate political force in Indian politics, right? I wanted to move away from that question, and I wanted to understand, electoral victories aside, how has Hindutva made forays into the cultural and social imagination of people at large? How do RSS workers and benefactors make meaning out of seva? What does seva mean to people who are actually going out and volunteering their time, their energy, and doing work selflessly? can we analytically hold both compassion and ideological assertion together? And what does this tell us about the limits of the secular critique? The conceptual framework that I worked on was as follows. 1. Seva as a religious, moral, intellectual, and instrumental tradition. So depending on what your disciplinary training is, people have generally studied Seva either as a religious institution or as a moral institution, or third, mostly as an instrumental tradition. So those who have been very critical of the RSS, and I'll talk about some of the work that criticizes their work, come down to talking about Seva just as a political strategy. So an earthquake happens, a disaster breaks out, or there is some crisis out there, and Swayamsevaks are there much before even state agencies arrive, because there is a clear instrumental goal. But I show through my work that the motivations for doing Seva are actually far more complicated. The conceptual framework also draws on Hindu reformist legacies and modern institutional discipline. And it functions, how Seva functions both as an ethical action and as a nation building strategy. What was my methodology? So the approach that I deployed in my work stands in contrast to the dominant approaches that have framed the study of Hindutva so far. As I have already mentioned, a large body of work on Hindutva or RSS or the other affiliates of the Sangh largely have highlighted the confrontational aspects of the movement, that it is a fundamentalist, communal, fascist movement. And even those studies which have specifically focused on their Seva work or humanitarian activities have examined these typically as an instrumental strategy. In light of the criticisms leveled against the RSS as being advocates of an irrational nativism, I seek to understand if the category of Seva is merely irrational, paternalistic, and morally vacuous, or is there something more to it? And how does progressive thought, quote unquote progressive thought, influenced by modern rationalist filters, limit our own understanding of such terms and their cultural currency? And interestingly, I was inspired by this American scholar named Ali Hochschild, who studies white nationalism. And one of the terms that she uses in her book is called climbing the empathy wall. The basic idea being that if you really want to understand a movement, you really want to understand the ethos, the spirit of what animates a social cultural movement, you begin with empathy, you begin with charity. You do not begin from a space of, I know it all, or you do not begin from a space of, oh, how demonic and how, problematic this organization is. Here I should also briefly mention the question of politics of Seva, right? And this is not just with regard to RSS that commentators have talked about the politics of Seva, but this has been studied fairly well since eons about how cultural, social, religious groups have often used Seva or humanitarian work for a certain political strategy. What I'm trying to argue here is that disaster relief becomes, of course, a moment of ideological interpellation, meaning when there is a crisis, through the work that I do and my cadre does, of course, it is a moment that helps translate and helps me spread the idea or the ideology that I stand for. But at the same time, it is not only instrumental mobilization that the organization is moving ahead with, and that there is compassion that coexists with this community mobilization. And I show through my work that RSS blends affective care with disciplinary outreach. Why do people turn to the RSS for humanitarian work? Some of the obvious reasons, if you know anything about the organization, is that they're extremely efficient. The scale and the reach of the organization often far exceeds the speed or the efficiency of state agencies. It creates volunteers are often seen as selfless, non-bureaucratic, and present in the moment. This creates emotional capital and relational legitimacy. Swayamsevaks who often work in the villages that they come from already have a sense of embeddedness in the community, and hence it is far more easier for them to go out and do seva work. This also creates emotional capital, trust, and community embeddedness. This is a picture that was printed rather in a newspaper. I think this is the Times of India, when RSS was banned for the first time in 1948. It's gone. Fine. And that's the photo of Gandhi, who has been assassinated. And in many ways, the 1948 ban was a very defining moment or a very defining milestone when the stereotyping of the Sangh actually begins, right? And what I'm trying to challenge through my work is the RSS has only been seen as an authoritarian, being only seen as an authoritarian or communal force in Indian politics is actually an inadequate or a limiting frame. That humanitarian work demands more moral complexity in evaluation, and recognizing the Sangh's appeal does not mean endorsing their activities. Other questions that animate my work are: is secularism equipped to engage with the non-secular life worlds? What happens when secular critique delegitimizes lived ethics? The compassionate Hindu is politically potent, and this is not an idea that's immediately dismissed. Let me unpack some of these things, right? In the larger development space or the philanthropic space that we see in India and elsewhere, there has been a marginalization, or there has been, not much value given to, so to speak, non-quote-unquote secular organizations. By which I mean that only those organizations which are seen to be aligning to very clear liberal, quote-unquote liberal secular frameworks are often seen as more legitimate actors in the field. And that is obviously problematic, because in many ways I've also argued in my book that to understand RSS is to understand Bharat, or to understand India. The kind of modalities, the modus operandi, the ideological mobilization that accompanies seva work of the RSS actually comes from a space that is very intrinsic or very different from the secular liberal space that we commonly associate the development space with. The second point up there is what happens when secular critique delegitimizes lived ethics, right? So why is it that beneficiaries of seva are more comfortable seeking support from the RSS as opposed to something far more secular? It could be a secular NGO, it could be something like a UN body, it could be something like the secular state. What is it about the vocabulary or the modality of a cultural group like the RSS that actually makes things work on the ground? Contributions of the book, it reframes the debate on Hindutva by foregrounding the everyday ethics of seva. It provides a more grounded understanding of the RSS's humanitarian work, and it opens up space to reflect on the limitations of the secular. The fieldwork that I engaged with, I did not want to bring it up in great detail, but there were two sites where I primarily did my research. One was in the aftermath of Bhuj earthquake. So the fieldwork, of course, happened almost 10 years after the earthquake had actually happened, but I was trying to engage with the stakeholders and my respondents in order to get a better sense of what did the response relief work of the RSS look like. in Bhuj after the earthquake. The other site was the Odisha super cyclone, which had taken place in 1999. And in both these sites, respondents told me a couple of things that were common across both these different states. One was that the men in khaki shorts were often the first to arrive soon after these disasters had struck. Second is relief work went hand in hand with everyday practices, everyday spiritual practices around prarthana, around shakhas that were organized in the course of relief work. Even the rehabilitation work that was done, the architecture of houses, of villages, the landscaping, particularly in Bhuj, in Gujarat, ways in which several sanskar kendras were set up in both these locations. It was not just an act of building houses or community centers, but there was a very strong cultural / Bharatiya Sanskar imbued rehabilitation that was at work here, right? The key arguments that I make through the book is that to understand the RSS only as a threat is to miss the question of why it works and why it has continued to not just survive but also flourish as one of the world's largest cultural social movements. And this is the centenary year, of course, of the Sangh. The moral complexity of humanitarian work needs to be understood at greater depth, right? Why Swayamsevaks do what they do cannot just be reduced to the idea of building a Hindu Rashtra. So for many of these Swayamsevaks who are actually working at the grassroots level, their own subjectivities of who they are, where they come from, how they acquire meaning out of their own work, there is a lot of space to undertake research in that particular field and to get a more complex, rounded understanding of what draws people to the movement. The idea and practice of seva needs to be analyzed in its own idiom and not within a framework that places conservative thought in a hierarchically inferior position than the secular rational, right? In very simple words, what I'm trying to say is that when we start creating a hierarchy of ideas where we place so-called conservative thought in a position which is far inferior to what we call rational secular thought, we are actually doing great disservice in understanding why these movements are so widely successful. Why this book now? This is a question that I've grappled with before coming to this festival, and one of the things that I would want to remind the audiences, because this is the centenary year of the RSS, and hence it's important for us to understand that as the RSS approaches 100 years, its seva model is being institutionalized and it's being scaled up like never before, right? So if you hear Mohan Bhagwatji speak, or if you hear any of the leadership of the Sangh, one hears repeatedly that they are alluding constantly to the idea of Samaj Seva or service. The Prime Minister recently celebrated his birthday on 17th September, which has again been declared to be as a day of Seva Divas, right? So Seva continues to be re-energized and reinvigorated as a category within the organization. The centenary is not just a moment of celebration for the RSS, but also one of strategic visibility and consolidation, right? And it is through Seva that they have built the kind of connections that they have with the Indian or the Bharatiya people at large. It is through seva that they have been actively been able to mobilize more cadres. It is through seva that they have been able to make a mark for themselves from being a small 5-member organization to becoming such a big movement today. Seva is now central to how the RSS legitimizes its presence in civil society. So far from being seen just as an organization that is interested in building a Ram temple or is interested in questions of cow protection, Seva in many ways has helped them revamp their understanding of who they are and present themselves as a more legitimate civil society actor in our country. The RSS's 100 years are therefore not only about ideology, they are about how affective service, volunteerism, and grassroots mobilization have shaped India. What was once auxiliary or what was once not a very big part of their work has today become the core of their identity. In many ways, Seva has become RSS's most effective soft power tool. There are many ways in which we wield or we mobilize power, whether it's a political party, whether it's a cultural movement. Very overt forms of political mobilization can, lead to something like a yatra or a procession, but there are more covert, there are more celebrated forms, very quiet ways in which one can go about building one's stature, and this is clearly one of them. Through Seva, the Sangh has created a parallel civic infrastructure that rivals state and secular NGO efforts, especially in rural and semi-urban India. So if you look at the modus operandi of the organization, you realize that the beneficiaries have also very carefully and strategically been chosen, right? So a number of affiliates of the RSS, such as the Vishwa Hindu Parishad or the Seva Bharti or the Vanvasi Kalyan Ashram, have particularly targeted Dalits, have particularly targeted tribal groups, which for very long have been mobilized by, let's say, Christian missionary organizations, or which have been targeted very instrumentally by other political groups. This demands a critical attention. What happens when care and compassion are woven into a nationalist project? And hence, the book is an invitation to development practitioners, to academics, to civil society organizations who are seriously invested in understanding the humanitarian space, to think through this a little more carefully and to reimagine the frameworks that they have been so used to adopting for so long. What the book offers at this juncture is it helps us get a better sense of the RSS's growing legitimacy in everyday life, and it encourages us to rethink the liberal suspicion also, and both the liberal suspicion and the romanticism surrounding Seva. What is the liberal suspicion? The liberal suspicion is that, cultural, religious groups often use Seva to fool people around, to raise massive funds, and to basically create a certain political ideology through the disguise of humanitarian work. That is one extreme imagination. On the other extreme imagination is also that a certain romantic idea of Seva being this very apolitical, very rather very spiritual sort of an institution that has completely immunized from day-to-day politics. I think both these extremes are not very helpful in helping us engage with Seva. The questions that I throw open before you are as follows. Can compassion be politically strategic and still be real, right? So is it all right for an organization to, engage in Seva that is deeply imbued with ideas of Hindutva? Can it also at the same time be politically strategic, and can we still be all right with it? Does secular critique risk invisibilizing certain ethical traditions? And is there a need to rethink secularism not just as a principle, but also as a political project? Yeah, I'm almost done. I didn't realize that was the last slide. But before I end, I would want to speak about a current project that I'm working on. As you see, and a lot of people have actually told me that the book is very academic, right? And it tries to use frameworks and conceptual understandings that are not entirely accessible to a lot of people, and that got me thinking, which is why I have begun, or rather almost on the verge of finishing my second project on the RSS again, which is 10 human stories of Swayamsevaks who have served in the RSS for over 3 or 4 decades. And what I encountered through these 10 interviews that I conducted and completed recently is what seva actually means to each of these Swayamsevaks is a function of several things, right? To begin with, it is a function of who these people actually are. What is their own positionality? What kind of family backgrounds they come from? So it's a function of that. Their own commitment to the idea of seva, their own commitment to humanitarian work is to a large extent conditioned by where they are coming from. But one thing that really stands out, and it's common across all these 10 respondents, is the kind of exposure or the kind of learning that they underwent in the shakhas that they attended, right? And each of them said, with the same amount of conviction, many of them have not even met each other. In fact, all 10 of these respondents, I think only 2 of them happen to know each other, but the rest are all unknown to each other. They shared that in many ways, their training in the Shakha helped them get a sense of their own role in society, right? What helped them make meaning out of their own lives, helped them respond to their own calling, helped them respond to what they thought was the true purpose of their life, right? So when we write about the RSS, whether it's mainstream media or when academics write about the RSS, in many ways it is pitched, the idea or the discourse is pitched at the level that here is this organization which has a very elite leadership, which has a very well thought out strategy of how it wants to go about creating a Hindu Rashtra. But when you actually start talking to the foot soldiers of the movement, when you actually start talking to the Swayamsevaks, you realize that at the end of the day, it is not some grandiose vision or mission that is driving them to do the work that they are doing, but in many ways, it's the immediate, almost everyday reality of their own life that is pushing them to do what they are doing, right? This book should be out hopefully by early next year, if I'm very fortunate by the end of this year. But it's important for us to at least recognize and acknowledge that there is something very elemental, there is something very, very raw and organic about the movement that has not been understood or tapped yet. I think I'll stop here, and I'm hoping to engage with you through the question answers session. If you have any questions, we can open it up. Yes, sir. No, it won't be recorded. Yeah.
Yeah. So, good morning, ma'am. This is in context of your beautifully written book. So, in your study of RSS in disaster relief work, how do you see the balance between humanitarian neutrality and ideological influence? Do you really think that any kind of relief work is ideologically free?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. The short answer is no. I don't think any humanitarian work is ideologically free, but that's not a problem according to me, right? Because ideologies come in all hues and colors. For anyone to claim just because we may have a more charitable view about an organization, I think it would be unfair to claim that whatever work that organization is doing is ideologically free. I don't think that's humanly possible. Because and let's, if you unpack ideology, it's not really a bad thing, right? It reflects in the work that we do, it reflects in our professional lives, our personal lives. I would like to believe that I have a set of ideologies in the ways in which I'm trying to raise my own daughter, right? Trying to pretend that I am absolutely neutral would be a misnomer. And hence, I don't think humanitarian work, whether this is being delivered by state agencies, whether this is being delivered by cultural groups, by the RSS, Christian missionaries, in nothing I think is ideologically free. And hence the humanitarian space is actually very, very political. But what kind of politics are you bringing to the table, I think is important to engage with. Thanks.
May I ask?
Yes, sir.
Sorry. My first sentence doesn't have anything to do with my question. And that is, since you're talking about disaster relief and humanitarian assistance, army is supposed to be the instrument of last resort. Of course, my Air Force colleague is sitting with me, so Air Force also. But somehow army turns out to be the first responders.
Yes.
That's what I've always noticed, and you'll agree with that.
Absolutely.
Okay, now, before my retirement, I was the member of the National Crisis Committee as Chief of Integrated Defense Staff. So I've handled this topic, coordinated the efforts of Army, Navy, and Air Force for disaster. RSS does great work, you've just told us, and I myself am aware of that. And there are several other NGOs who do this to small measure, but RSS as a force has been doing this for decades, right? I recognize that. The question is, if you can answer, otherwise just leave it as my comment, is that since I was as a part of coordinating this effort at national level under the Cabinet Secretary, when NDRF gets involved, SDRF, many other bodies get involved, we need coordination.
Yes.
But in that coordination, as RSS as a big contributing force that goes into disaster relief, I personally don't find that being coordinated at the spot level or event level. Mm-hmm. So don't you think it'll be better if they themselves offered themselves to be a part of a coordinated effort?
You mean under the aegis of the state?
It's not the state. It's always at that event. If there is a flood in Bombay or something in Cochin, then some coordination effort is done over there.
Right.
So rather than these smaller NGOs do work in isolation here and there, and they are all doing a good job with great spirit. Since RSS is a very bigger force, it's a force multiplier, I think it can also come into the umbrella of the coordinated effort on the spot or in the region where the disaster relief is required.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. So my fieldwork actually reveals that in many situations they have actually worked in very close coordination with the state, right? Gujarat is a clear example. And as a political science person, if you ask me, of course, there are situations where they can find that coordination to be far more smooth, and they find it much easier to coordinate with state agencies because the government is more sympathetic to them. But in other situations where the government may not be as sympathetic, they are deliberately kept at bay, right? And which is to do with the fact that the government or the state is equally a political actor, right? It's not like the state is an apolitical entity, so to speak. But even left to themselves, I think the coordination efficiency that they bring to the table is absolutely remarkable. I mean, I've heard of stories where within a matter of half an hour, they've managed to bring together, close to 3,000 swamsevaks in one spot. Yeah. Something here. Yes, sir. Yes.
This is with respect to your book, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in your book, actually, you have used frameworks from academics like Rumila Thapa,
yes,
Anjana Chatterjee,
mm-hmm.
and people like Mirananda.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And you have actually used that framework as the basis for your study, and you have actually not even questioned them. Now that you have gone through the entire work of RSS, is there any change in you that you should actually reframe your approach to studying the RSS?
Thank you, sir. Very candid, very interesting question. I just want to make a small correction. I'm not sure if I have used their frameworks to explain my work. Okay, I engage with these frameworks because whether you like it or not, in academia, they are very, very dominant frameworks, and they continue to be very dominant frameworks. Again, I should also quickly remind you that I was writing my PhD in JNU, right? And and it's not about JNU then and JNU now, but let us not pretend that universities are neutral ecosystems, right? So what you come up with as a thesis, and I should also quickly add that the entire publishing world, of course, today things are far more democratized. But even 7-8 years ago, the publishing world was equally, it does work in very deeply political ways. And in many ways, as a writer, you are constantly wrestling with the question of how do I position my work in a way that does not entirely dismiss given dominant frameworks. So that's the response to the first question. To the second one, of course, I think having interviewed so many people in the last so many years, even after my book has been published, there is a transformation. In many ways, I think the epistemic categories and the frameworks that a lot of these scholars that you have named have used are problematic. And today I feel far more confident, saying more confidently that they are not entirely, let's say, helpful in helping us understand this organization or the movement. Yeah, does that answer your question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, agreed that all humanitarian work has the ideological colors.
Yes.
But if you look at the track record of Christian missionary disaster relief, including the recent tsunami here,
Yes.
there were large-scale conversions.
Yeah.
And there was a clear aim of conversion and a demographic build-up as part of that. But in the same disaster, the work by RSS did not result in any conversion
Sure.
of the Christian communities in those coastal regions into Hinduism, though RSS is a Hindu organization.
Yes.
So there is a clear difference
Sure.
between both. So one is, I mean, the Christian missionaries can be called a breaking India force, and RSS is a building India force. So do you agree that we need to, you cannot simply, put both of them under the same bracket, that it is all ideological.
Sure.
You need to, I mean, we need to take a stand as to, which is good for India and
Yeah.
which is bad for India. What do you
Sure. Absolutely. The idea is not, when I say that every humanitarian force is ideological, the idea is not to say that ideologies are homogeneous. Certainly not. But as a scholar, I will not go there. Okay? As a scholar, I will not, and that is my personal decision, and that has nothing to do with how academic scholarly work has to be. But as a scholar, I would leave it on to the reader to decide how they would want to interpret it, right? But I think there is that little bit of restraint that I think is necessary for us to maintain as people who engage with ideas. Yes.
Because I mean, for example, in the case, the Kudangulam nuclear project,
Yes.
opposition
Right.
was predominantly coordinated by the same Christian NGOs
Right.
who were very active in the tsunami relief.
Sure.
So even as an academic, you actually have a very strong case as to how these forces
Right.
are actually acting as anti-national, right? So why won't you record it and take a
Because-
stand as an academic?
Because I do not work on the Christian missionaries. I do not work on them. So if I were to work on Christian missionary activities, and if my research question were to do with, do I think they are doing anti-national work? Sure, I would want to give you a very clear position there. But that's not my area of research. I'm trying to understand something related, but I'm trying to understand the moral complexity of what the Sangh is trying to do. Can we take that one last question? He's been waiting for a while. Yeah.
Ma'am, it's a pleasure to know you, and then it's inspiring to see the works. A short question for me is, it's been 17 years that I understood and heard about the RSS, and it took so many important people in my life to inspire me to come and address one of the sessions, say 6 months or 3 months back. There are a lot of reasons to that. For a common man's perspective, there are a lot of myths which needs to be debunked,
Yes.
and this has to be brought onto the picture.
Yes.
Because it's an organization which runs for 100 years without an head, without any major curriculum or agenda, though it has its own SOPs. This is something which I feel more to be brought onto the public space more, and this is my message to them also when they
Yes.
invited me as a guest. And I feel some clarity on this regard, or directions or works on this regard, would really bring more people onto the nation building activities in a more structured manner.
Absolutely. In fact, I'll just quickly respond. So you're absolutely right. In fact, even in this book, one of the stereotypes that I've tried to address is that the Sangh only works for Hindu beneficiaries, right? And I throw through archives of the organizer and through a lot of interviewing that I have done on the ground. Even those who are non-RSS members have clearly reported that, the relief runs across religious lines and across caste lines. So that kind of stereotyping breaking, I have attempted in my own small way. Yeah. Yes. Sure. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you. Yeah.